Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. A good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome. My name is Taylor, and I am DWDC's Operations Coordinator. And today I am joined by my colleagues Amanda and Kelsey. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here today is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These nations continue to experience ongoing colonization and displacement. Today, Toronto is covered by Treaty Number 13 and the Williams Treaties. Dying with Dignity Canada is also mindful of the broken treaties that have occurred across Turtle Island and recognize our responsibility as treaty people to engage in a continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all people across the land. So, I am thrilled to welcome you today to our special series offered for DWDC volunteers only. In a survey conducted last year, 90% of our volunteers indicated that they found value in receiving regular updates from us so that they could be in the know around end of life choice, which is why we are here today and so happy to be able to offer you this exclusive presentation. Through our webinars, we aim to provide each of you with information and key takeaways, as well as to create a space for conversation around end of life topics. So before we jump into it, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. So everyone on the call today is muted. However, there will be some opportunities to submit your questions. We will not be pausing to address questions as we go. So to submit any burning questions you have as we move along, please type them into the Q&A bar that you can find on the bottom of your Zoom panel or perhaps on the side of your screen. We will read out your submitted questions on your behalf during the Q&A portion at the end. But because this is a volunteer exclusive webinar and we love to have a bit more community amongst us, we will also take live questions during the Q&A portion. And we ask that you use the raise your hand icon you can see on the screen, and that will indicate your interest in presenting your own question. Again, if you'd like us to sort of address it on your behalf, use the Q&A, but if you'd like to address your own question, you're welcome to raise your hand and we'll call on you one at a time when we get to the Q&A portion. So while we are going to try to get to as many questions as possible, unfortunately, we may not get to everyone today. So if you do have any outstanding questions that are personal in nature or something we just didn't get to cover today, you can go ahead and please email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca and we will follow up with you. This session, for everyone's notice, is being recorded. There will also be a brief post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen after the webinar and will give everyone an opportunity to share their feedback. We are especially looking forward to having volunteers submit ideas around topics or questions we can use to guide future sessions of webinars that we'll be offering to volunteers, more coming into the new year. And now, to introduce today's presenter, we have Sherry Moran, who many of you may know. Sherry is a retired lawyer and a federal government executive who gained extensive experience in the development of governance structures, both in her career and through her work on boards in the nonprofit and charitable sectors. Sherry has served on the board of Dying with Dignity Canada and continues to volunteer with those in the Ottawa chapter, advocating for changes in MAID policy and legislation. Thank you so much, Sherry, for joining us today. We're so excited to have you. And she's kindly prepared a presentation for us. So, Sherry, I will pass the floor to you to get us started.
Thank you, Taylor. I have a PowerPoint presentation that will be coming up now. And that will lead me, I can't see it, so I hope you can.
Yeah, so just one moment, everyone. I'm just switching PowerPoints here. Thank you for your patience. We'll be getting started in just a moment.
I noticed a couple of people who were in Dublin, so I'm looking forward to hearing their commentary at the end of my presentation.
All right, perfect. Looks like the presentation is up on the screen when you're ready, Sherry.
There you go. I'm so pleased to be here today to share what I heard at the World Federation Conference hosted by End of Life Ireland in Dublin this past September. I've summarized what's more than a 2-day conference into a 40-minute presentation. And I want to say at the beginning that any errors are my own. And if you catch any, please correct me in the chat or in the commentary and the Q's and A's after the presentation. And if you want more detail about the various speakers that I'll be talking about, you're going to find recordings for most of them at the End of Life Ireland site. And Taylor will be putting that link for you in the chat. So the takeaway, history of the World Federation. The World Federation, which is the next slide, it really started, well, almost 50 years ago. As you can see, Japan invited Australia, Right to Die societies from Australia, the Netherlands, the UK, and the US. And that was in 1976. They met in Tokyo. They formed what they called the Tokyo Declaration, which was essentially, we want to make legal our right to die with dignity in peace and without suffering. So there was a meeting in San Francisco, and the third one at Oxford in the UK basically formally established the World Federation. And they developed a resolution right at the outset, which was, first of all, to invite all voluntary euthanasia and right to die societies to affiliate with them, and then to promote this cooperation through disseminating information about euthanasia and assisted dying, including court cases, legislation in the various member countries. And they did this and just continue to do this, you can see from their website, through newsletters and through conferences every 2 years. And as I noted, ironically, Japan and the UK still have no assisted dying, even though their right to die societies were part of the original 5. And as many of you will know, it is underway in England at this time, and we'll be talking about that later on. Japan is hosting the next Federation Conference meeting in November of 2026. That will be 50 years after they hosted the first meeting. So hopefully assisted dying will move along in Japan before that time. Takeaways. I want to add one more fact about the World Federation. It includes 60 right to die organizations from 30 countries. I understand there are actually over 80 right to die organizations, but they don't all choose to be part of the Federation, but a large number do. And there are only 12 countries that have assisted dying legislation. So assisted suicide is still a crime without exception for assisted dying in most countries around the world. And for those of you who attended the conference that we hosted, Dying with Dignity Canada in Toronto in 2022, you will note that one takeaway is definitely the same, and that's the contrast between Canada and other member countries. Although we may look at our own made legislation and see its flaws, first and foremost, the mental illness exclusion, the fact that we can't make advance requests legally, and also forced transfers through the implementation of our law. But we're so much further ahead of many countries, ones that have no assisted dying legislation, and those that do, but that are restricted by diagnosis, as we are with mental illness, but also by prognosis, in that they have to have an illness where they're expected to die within a certain period of time. So they're struggling against the lawmakers and the courts for the tiniest of strides, as I've indicated. And our End of Life Ireland hosts reached out to a lot of Irish doctors to attend their conference, and they were finding ways to actually pay for them, the ones who couldn't afford to come, toward the end. And that was the right thing to do. Legislators as well, but it'll be doctors who will be able to push this conversation along. Other takeaways, and these are my own personal ones, so others may have had slightly different ones. The keynote speaker was an Irish GP and also professor of medicine, Professor O'Dowd. And he said that way back when, he was very concerned about assisted dying. And a lot of GPs do have concerns. They're not necessarily against it in principle, but they want their concerns met. And he came to the point of realizing that it really, in patient-centered approach to practicing medicine, it's really part of true cradle to grave patient care. And what was interesting was where he talked about the Irish and death and dying. And he said they have to draw on their tradition of wakes, religion, spirituality, artists, and poets as they move toward assisted dying. And in that respect, he ended his speech by saying, oh my God. Okay, sorry, Amanda. I'm seeing your chat. Okay, he ended his speech, Professor O'Dowd, by recommending a book by Kevin Toulis. Kevin Toulis is a journalist and filmmaker, and he wrote My Father's Wake: How the Irish Teach Us to Live, Love, and Die. And I'm about a third of the way through. And as a journalist, he's a very good writer. But it's the most different book I've ever read about dying, and it's very good. I highly recommend it. Another takeaway for me was Jane Morris, who's the head of Dying with Dignity, Victoria, Australia, the state of Victoria, and her group were promoted what she called an age-defying or an ageless advocacy by establishing the Young Ambassadors Initiative. And they recruited young people from across Australia. It's become a national initiative seeking to provide younger Australians with the information, the skills, and platforms necessary to champion the cause of end-of-life rights. And they say it best. So we have a very short YouTube video that Amanda's going to try and get up for you to see the Young Ambassadors.
Okay, everyone, just one moment. We're going to go ahead and pause the PowerPoint and we're going to open up the video. Just one moment. Okay, we're going to go ahead and just get started in one moment.
Ambassadors are a group of young people who believe in the power of choice. Choice in how we live and choice in how we leave this world. We strive to create a world where every person has access to quality end-of-life care options, including voluntary assisted dying.
We're a group of young people that want to encourage open and honest conversations about end of life.
I believe everybody has the right to live a good life and to also have a good death.
My connection with Dying with Dignity Victoria is a pretty personal one. My mum passed away many years ago now. With her illness, we knew that that was terminal, that we knew that there was a certain time frame that she had to live. So she was extremely proactive in understanding what her options were. Although it's not going to be the end result that we wished for, she's ultimately going to have choice, which gave us comfort.
I joined the Dying with Dignity Youth Ambassadors quite recently. My fiancé, Alex Blaine, used the voluntary assisted dying medication on the 5th of January 2021. Alex cared so much about dying with dignity. Everyone should have that end-of-life experience.
We want to be better at listening, to understand the issues people face, advocate for change, inform people about the choices available to them, connect people to services and supports, encourage conversations, and grow the movement of young people advocating for end-of-life care issues.
It's extremely rewarding being connected to the group. We've all got our own jobs, but we still come together, think about what we can do to make a change, particularly when it comes to awareness for younger people.
The Young Ambassadors are the people that are going to take this amazing organisation into the future. We're here for the long haul, and we're here to try and help government understand what younger people want in the future and in the present.
As young people, we think, we're immortal, nothing can get to us, but unfortunately, that's so not true. I hope that we can continue conversations, normalise death and grief, because as we age, having that knowledge and choices is really powerful.
Join us in our mission to make quality end-of-life choices a reality for all people. Together, we can create a future where every voice is amplified and every choice is respected.
Okay,
We'll go
just
back
one,
to, I
just
have
one
one
moment.
more takeaway. Yeah.
I'm just gonna start sharing the PowerPoint. Just 1 second, everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
We all know about the English bill, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But there's just two things that sort of struck me right at the beginning. And one was that the MP whose bill it is, private member Kim Leadbeater, uh, she basically said that with the law in Britain right now of assisted suicide being a crime, with no exceptions to that, that when people are near end of life, their only options are suffering, Switzerland, or suicide. And another point that I wanted to share here was that My Death, My Decision and Dying, Dignity and Dying are the two big support groups for assisted dying in England. My Death, My Decision were at Dublin, and I spoke to a rep there. And he basically said that what his organization was looking for was those of sound mind who are incurably suffering or terminally ill, which he called the Canada model. So they want more than simply people at end of life because of a terminal illness. And but along with Dignity and Dying, they are supporting the 6-month terminally ill approach that's now in the House of Commons in London. They refer to that as the Oregon or the Australian state solution. So, highlights of assisted dying around the world. Terminology, you'll be really thrilled to know I'm not going to lead you through this slide. Simply put, euthanasia means physician administered death, and assisted dying means physicians assess and provide the substance, but the person self administers it. And you'll see more of that, more countries with that approach. You'll hear me then refer to both euthanasia and assisted dying when I'm talking about the Netherlands and Belgium, or VAD, voluntary assisted dying, when referring to the Australian states and territories, or assisted suicide when talking about Switzerland. But because our MAID legislation has physician administered and self-administered, although the latter is very, very few people choose, I can default to MAID in most instances because in most cases we're talking about both physician administered and self-administered. So I want to start with countries that already have laws in place. Switzerland, you've all heard about all our lives about the fact that it was a place that accepted assisted suicide tourists. It really started in 1942 when a court case in a court in Switzerland basically said, yes, assisted suicide is a crime, but there could be an exception to that where a physician basically provides information to a person who wants to die, who's suffering, and sort of helps them through the process without active euthanasia. And this was okay as long as they weren't doing it for what the courts called selfish reasons. And as I understand it, that means like a family member, again, it's coercion, pushing somebody to make this choice to end their life, or a doctor who thinks that they know best for their patient and so is coercing the patient. So they have done this. They've done this for a very long time. Dignitas is a nonprofit organization that was set up in 1998. So the representative from there, he was in Toronto as well, Sylvain, and he basically said that they're promoting assisted dying in other countries. They don't want to be the recipient of assisted suicide tourists anymore. In their early years, it was a lot of people from Germany, where the courts are moving, but there is no real clear legislation in place. And in latter years, it's been people coming from England. And there's a lot of media coverage because when family members or friends go with someone to Dignitas for them to have end of life assistance, when they come back, they're often arrested or brought into the police station and questioned over many hours and investigated as helping somebody to assisting their suicide, even though it was in another country. And then that ends up in the media. Now there's yet to be a prosecution in Britain, but there have been a lot of people who have been basically picked up and brought to the police station for questioning, and then it hits the papers, as I said. So Dignitas, I think they're tired of that kind of media coverage. So he said basically, you know, over 26 years, more than 4,000 deaths, that's enough. So let's help other countries move along and get their own legislation in place. The US, we now have 10 states in the District of Columbia that have assisted dying laws in place to allow physicians to prescribe a substance for or medication for terminal patients to self-administer. So there are other alternatives that are promoted by nonprofits in the states. VSED, voluntary stoppage of eating and drinking, and self-administered gases. And they're allowed to do this because of freedom of speech under the US Constitution, but they can't be any more proactive than that. They can provide information to people, including telling them where to get the paraphernalia they would need to self-administer gases. And that's all perfectly legal. But again, it's the ones, even the states that have assisted dying laws, it's much more restrictive than our track one was. Spain, one of the recent assisted dying laws came into force in 2021. We had a speaker telling us that there are data now for 2022 and a little less data for 2023, but it's raising more questions than it's answering. There's only because they have 2 independent physicians assessing, and then this commission can either authorize or deny. It's a very, very long process, 75 days on average, and only 50% approval rate. 2023 was showing a 44% approval rate. So it's not looking good. They need to investigate the data more. He's very concerned that there's a lot of discrimination against assisted dying built into the commissions. 1/3 of applicants died during the process. That's not surprising. So the next slide, more laws in place. We call the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, the ones who've had all the experience in this area because they've had laws in place since 2002 or Luxembourg 2009. And even before then, the courts in the Netherlands had over several decades developed criteria for physicians to perform what is commonly called voluntary euthanasia without criminal consequences. And I just wanted to note in the second bullet, it's basically saying the controversy never ends, which is discouraging but true. And we had one researcher presenting to us in Dublin on debunking the fear of the slippery slope in the Netherlands. And they've been at this for decades through the courts and through legislation since 2002. And yet the current debate is among Dutch psychiatrists who are opposed to euthanasia and assisted dying for those with psychiatric disorders. And they're saying that the numbers are out of control. Way too many people are using euthanasia for psychiatric disorders, or what we would call mental illness as the sole underlying medical condition. But as the researcher indicated, and she looked at data from 2013 to 2023, I only presented the ones from 2023, but it stayed within that range of 1 to 2% of total euthanasias. And we've always predicted that based on the Netherlands and other sources, that if mental illness as the sole underlying cause was not excluded from MAID in Canada, there would be very few people who would qualify as being chronically ill enough to be able to access MAID under our law. So you can see for 2023, 9,068 euthanasia deaths in the Netherlands, and only 1.5% of those were for psychiatric disorders. One other point about the Netherlands that the researchers shared with us is that they have a due care criterion for their practitioners, which includes you have to ensure capacity, informed consent, all of that. And it goes to a review committee afterwards, not as part of the approval process. And the review committee is comprised of a lawyer, a doctor, and an ethicist. And out of those 9,068 euthanasia deaths last year, only 5 were found not to meet the due care criteria. Okay, now we're going to Australia and New Zealand. And for those of you who are there in Toronto, they were in force then and they were in force in Dublin. It's lovely to see them. They're in the early days of their legislation and just so passionate about it. Australia, all 6 states now have voluntary assisted dying laws, and the Australian Capital Territory, Northern Territory, is underway. So that will cover the entire country. I look at the Victoria state law most because they have the 6 and 12. And that means that you have to be have an illness where you're likely to die within 6 months. If it's a neurodegenerative illness that you're likely to die from, then there's a 12-month prognosis period. They have a gag clause. I want to talk about that when we talk about New Zealand. And they have conscientious objection by clinicians and institutions, as do New Zealand. As you can see, they had a court case even before their law came into place. The court case was in 2020, and it was the New Zealand hospices that were looking to find out whether or not they could conscientiously object to assisted dying and therefore refuse to provide it on their premises. And the judge at that time said yes, that they could conscientiously object. And that's of interest to us because we are part of a lawsuit in BC where we're trying to stop forced transfers. And part of our argument is that publicly funded hospitals and hospices can't refuse to provide MAID practitioners within those buildings, that bricks and mortar, and it can conscientiously object and not be involved in the process, but not the buildings and the organizations operating the healthcare facilities themselves. And we're saying that there is no such right for them under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this New Zealand court case, I hope that it gets overturned at some point. It was very early days. The law wasn't even in place, so we'll have to see. Okay, the France, Iceland, South Korea, and Scotland. Okay, France basically introduced a bill earlier this year following what they call a citizens convention, where they randomly picked like many, I think it was like 170 or so French citizens to look at this topic of assisted dying. It's what we would call a citizens assembly. And the majority of that convention basically voted for active assistance in dying. So the bill was drafted. They didn't show a prognosis date of 6 months, 12 months, et cetera, but it talked about advanced or terminal prognosis nevertheless. And that bill essentially, in Canadian terms, died on the order paper because President Macron dissolved the National Assembly in June. I could find no indication. So if any of you know that has been reintroduced, but I understand that there are MPs across the political spectrum in the National Assembly in France that do want some kind of assisted dying legislation. Now, Iceland, South Korea, and Scotland, they're all what we would call private members' bills that they have that have been introduced at some point this year. And those often travel at a snail's pace and often die in the order paper. Kelsey was recently in Reykjavik, invited by the Right to Die Society there. So I'm hoping when we're in the discussion area of this presentation that she'll be able to update us on that. Scotland, I actually got a little more intelligence yesterday. When it was tabled in March, it went to the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee, and they sought views of individuals and groups over the summer, and they started their hearings in November, and their final one is scheduled for early February. So we'll hear more about that. And in case you're wondering about how this all works in the UK, this kind of topic is something that is within the mandate of the Scottish Parliament, the North of Ireland Parliament, the Isle of Man Parliament. And so when we talk about the UK bill, we're talking about just England and Wales. And we're talking about UK Parliament right now. I don't know if everybody's been following it. It's almost hard to avoid it. Kim Leadbeater, as I mentioned earlier, she tabled her private members bill. She won some kind of lottery to get it to go faster than normal private members bills. And it came up for debate last Friday at second reading. And they did vote yes to send it to committee, which is huge. As you can see, it passed at that point by 330 to 275. And just to give you an idea of how much of a shift this is, the private members bill that was defeated in 2015 at Westminster, only 117 people supported the assisted dying bill. So they've gone almost 3 times in terms of their support for this. It has really turned around. It is a very restrictive bill. I think she was basing it on the Australian model, but I think she missed out on a couple of points, which we'll discuss. And in addition, because it's such a burdensome process, because it's 2 doctors, 2 independent assessments, as we have. In between each assessment, it has to be a 7-day period of reflection. And then they have to go to the high court, go to a high court judge to either approve or deny that it has met the criteria. And then after that, there's a 14-day reflection period. And that can be shortened to 48 hours if the first doctor agrees that the person could die within a month. But still, it's a very burdensome process, and you worry that it will be like Spain, and that 1/3 of them will not make it to their day of provision, either because they have died or because they've lost capacity. Because this bill is, you're expected to die within 6 months, and you have to, it's self-administered. So physicians assess, physicians provide the substance, but the patient actually self-administers. And I put in a bullet here on who's for or against, and most of this comes from the House of Commons library report that was prepared on the bill. Our parliamentary library does the same thing for bills, and this is awesome if you really want to get into it. It's got the history of the previous bills, including in the Senate. There were a number in the Senate that got defeated, and who's supporting, who's opposed, other jurisdictions around the world, and the details of the bill. And in terms of who's for or against, this is another huge shift in the last decade, because professional health associations such as the British Medical Association, the Royal Colleges, the Nurses Association, Hospice UK, like a decade ago, they were all opposed to assisted dying, and they have moved to neutral, which is right in the middle. So they're not supporting or opposed, but that's a huge shift because they're the ones that implement this. So if you don't get the doctors, in our case, the nurse practitioners on side, or enough of them, then this bill will go nowhere. The advocacy groups and support I mentioned earlier, the big ones are My Death, My Decision, and Dignity in Dying. And the library, House of Commons library report indicated all religious institutions are against assisted dying. They don't want any exceptions to assisted suicide. And I just put in the 2, they're very strong opposing groups, but the names, Care Not Killing and Not Dead Yet UK, seem to be just very English. And Not Dead Yet UK is a disability advocacy group that is very strong in the in the country. So just a couple more points I want to make about the bill is in addition to this burdensome process, it means that people are going to have a hard time staying alive through it. The bill nowhere mentions suffering. And even the Australian law, which is 6 months death expected within 6 months or 12 months if it's from a neurodegenerative illness, they still have, like all other assisted dying bills, they have something about suffering. So one of the eligibility criterion there is, and the illness is causing suffering to the person that cannot be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable. So it makes you, back one, Amanda, I'm still on the UK. It makes you wonder, and I'd like to hear from people in the discussion whether you feel the same thing. But it seems to me this is a very, very restrictive bill, and it could never be expanded if they don't talk about suffering being the basis of why we have these laws. Thank you. We'll go into Ireland, our hosts. Road to legislation is going to be a little tough for them. Like our Carter case, they had one involving Marie Fleming, and she was seeking an order from the court permitting her to be lawfully assisted to have a peaceful and dignified death at the time of her choice without risk of prosecution for anyone who helped her. She had MS. She was very much declining. She died later in the year that the Supreme Court issued their decision, and she wanted her husband to be able to assist her without being prosecuted. She and two women who followed her really captured the attention of the public in the same way that Sue Rodriguez did with us in the 1990s. The court said no, the assisted suicide law in Ireland was constitutional. Carter decided that ours was, in cases of assisted dying where somebody has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and there's intolerable, enduring and intolerable suffering. Carter said all that would be an exception. And if the assisted suicide clause in our criminal code prevented that it would go against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So their court was different. They said no, it's not unconstitutional, but they did say that they could see Parliament being able to draft something that would fit within, could be an exception to the law. Specifically, they said nothing in this judgment should be taken as necessarily implying that it would not be open to the state in the event that the Parliament were satisfied that measures with appropriate safeguards could be introduced to legislate to deal with a case such as that as Marie Fleming. So the road to legislation continues, and following these various court cases, they established a joint parliamentary committee. So the Oireachtas, which is my only attempt at Gaelic mispronunciation, is Parliament. And so there were people from the House of Representatives and their Senate on this committee. And they reported earlier in this year, and they had 38 recommendations regarding legislation to allow a right for those already approaching end of life in challenging and unfortunate conditions to bypass their own pain and suffering to die compassionately. And you can see this was contentious, and this is the Australian model again. But even this step, 3 members dissented, including the chair of the committee. And in terms of safeguards, the focus here is on concerns about coercion, consent, and capacity. And what I wanted to underline for all of you today is that when they talk about coercion, they're not just talking about individual coercion, like a family member trying to get you to die even shorter than 6 months or 12 months, depending on the circumstance, or other people who are subtly trying to influence the person. They mean coercion also viewed broadly, and that includes socioeconomic or social circumstances, social conditions, causing a person to seek an assisted death earlier than they would die naturally. So it's important to keep in mind. Okay, the End of Life Ireland, their lived experience. This End of Life Ireland really understands that the fastest way to get the legislation that they want in place is through the public. The public are always ahead of legislators on these matters. We know that with advanced requests. I mean, over 80% of people want it, but it hasn't happened yet, except in Quebec. And so at least a quarter, I would think, of the presentations over the 2 days came from individuals who were terminal or had neurodegenerative illnesses, or their family members, for people who had already died. And they were all speaking in favor of choice. And the one that I want to share with you today is Siobhan's. Siobhan's 42 years old. She has muscular dystrophy. She had a cancer at one point, but she basically didn't even give details. She said she handled that. But she knows that with her muscular dystrophy, her suffering will become intolerable someday. And it's the way she likened it, her illness to a prison sentence, her body to a prison cell. And she says she has a right to early parole when her suffering is to a point that's enduring and intolerable. So she started by saying she really didn't have much experience in public speaking, and she was very matter of fact in her tone, and she somehow managed to grab my heart, and I'm sure everybody else's as well, because I hear she was since been invited to the Right to Die Society in Norway when they met in November, and she was a presenter. So I don't know if it was by Zoom or in person. She still does get around a bit, but anyhow, yay for Siobhan. Okay, I want to talk at the end here about our Canadian presenters and the highlights from Canada. The media that we've been seeing, like man about to lose his home, could become homeless. So his only option, he has some disabilities, and his only option is to try to seek MAID. And we've seen these stories in even MAID, like Globe and Mail, Toronto Star. It's not just the faith magazines, etc. It's very discouraging. And believe me, our colleagues from around the world have seen those as well. Associated Press is really good at picking that up and sending it out there. If it bleeds, it leads. And our representatives, Stephanie Green, Jocelyn Downey, Ellen Weave, Eric Matheson, they had to talk to our colleagues from all these Right to Die associations who they know our law. They know it's more complicated than that, but the media is there. And, as I said, it's some very well thought of media. So they had questions, and they were very well answered by all the Canadians there. I had to appreciate Jocelyn Downey. Professor Downey started her presentation by saying, Canadian MAID is not a dumpster fire. And she got a great laugh. And then she used an expression I haven't heard in years. She said, we all know that a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And that was just so true. So they went through how strong our eligibility criteria are, how rigorous our safeguards are, that nobody is going to get MAID because they're poor or because they may become homeless. And they're really good. And I'm doing a lot more too now by saying, yes, you see those stories in the paper, but the you never see the follow-up. Did the man apply for MAID? Did the man apply for MAID, and was he accepted? Because if he did, he had morbidities that were far more serious. I don't mean to downplay homelessness, that were serious enough to make him eligible for MAID, and it wasn't his incipient homelessness that was doing it. I should say too that our Canadian speakers noted that the people who don't choose MAID do not choose MAID because of a lack of disability support services. And indeed, 98.9%, I believe this was 2022, of those who needed disability support services and received MAID had received or had access to those services. So there is no slippery slope here. Eric Matheson, our U of T ethicist, he took a new perspective on this, and he talked about vulnerability, because he knows that people have a concern, particularly in debate around our track 2, that vulnerable people will make an inauthentic choice. Something will force them to make a choice to end their life that is inauthentic. But he said they can also make authentic choices. And he reminded us that Carter said that not just vulnerable people seek mate. So he took us in his wonderful ethics, philosophical way through the argument that in the end, you can only say that there is not enough of a risk to warrant a ban, and that you try to address that fear of inauthentic choices by vulnerable people through safeguards and eligibility criteria, and we've done just that. So our last page on on our sorry, our highlights from Canada. Many of you have heard Jill Breeze either in Toronto or on webinars, I believe, run by Dying with Dignity. She spoke in Dublin about her husband Wayne's death, and she did it alongside his Dr. Dawes, and it was brilliant. And her niece was there as well, Kashmir. She spoke individually about her uncle's death and the impact on her, and then she was part of a panel of Irish family members. It was, again, very well done. Now, my next point is my last point, and I can't remember where it was said, but to me, it was brilliant as well. Professor Downey explained that the process in Quebec, and remember, she's speaking to mainly clinicians in this room, Irish GPs in particular. She explained that the process in Quebec began with clinicians catalyzing the dialogue, engaging the public over the years, and that led to almost no partisanship when their end-of-life legislation was first passed, and even last year when they added in advanced requests. And she contrasted that with the toxic process federally, where it's hyper-partisan and it's gotten worse as we went through Bill C-7 with the Special Joint Committee and where we ended up with mental illness. So she's basically saying, you doctors control this conversation and you can move it ahead, and you can move it ahead in a way that you should alleviate the concerns of the legislators and the public and make sure you get a good law in place. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
All right, everybody. So we have one question up at the start. I want to remind everybody that if you'd like to have a question that we address on your behalf, please feel welcome to put it in the Q&A box. Or if you'd like to bring forth your own question, please use the raise your hand emoji. I see we have a couple, and then we'll get going. So first up, Sherry, I know we spoke about this a bit today, but somebody asks, how would you summarize the eligibility criteria differing from one country to another? And which country and state offers MAID to non-residents, maybe aside from that in Switzerland, if any?
I'll start with the non-residents. Belgium doesn't have a residency requirement, so a lot of people from France who are at end of life, in particular, go to Belgium for provisions, but they're very quiet about it, so you don't hear it. I don't know about other countries. Perhaps somebody else on the call does. And eligibility criteria. Well, we seem to either have physician administered or self-administered, and most of them are self-administered. Like all of the US legislation, like the physician does the assessment, have to be terminal. I believe there's suffering in their legislation. Each of the states' legislations, each of the 10, and are a little bit different, but essentially they are self-administered and terminal. Same with Australia, same with New Zealand. So it's Canada, and we're more following you can call it the Canada model, but other people call it the Dutch model. And they've gone further. So the Netherlands and Belgium, they have mature minors in there. They don't call them that, but it can be for children as well, but they have to have capacity. So that's how it becomes like mature minors. Right. But they're basically allowing both physician administered and self-administered. And they're also looking at more than terminal. They're looking at people who is suffering. It's again, enduring an intolerable suffering that people are facing either because of a physical or a psychiatric disorder. Other countries, I'm trying to think. Well, I believe Spain is, although they're not getting good results, theirs is also more like the Dutch model. So it would be for both terminally and people who are suffering terribly from a chronic illness. I'm going to get in trouble using language that isn't in their laws, but yeah, essentially, I'm trying to think of where else. Oh, Colombia is kind of an outlier in a way. They had their constitutional court in the 1990s come out and say there's an exception to assisted suicide for certain kinds of euthanasia, but it hasn't been well implemented. And I can't even remember if they have legislation in place, but I know that it's still a fight. There's people still going to courts to try to make it clearer. So we were very, very fortunate that our Supreme Court in Carter gave us so much in terms of what the legislation should look like. Other courts are a little more careful about providing that information. And so the legislatures, as we know, are small c conservative and don't really want to go there. So they need a lot of direction to be told where to go. I'm trying to think of what else I'm missing. Any in Asia? No. Australia and New Zealand. And they are self, that's interesting. Australia and New Zealand, Australia, they have, is self-administered unless the individual cannot, for whatever reason, take the prescription or the medication. They may have trouble swallowing because they're near end of life, etc. And in those cases, the physician can administer it. And I believe it ended up being about 1/3 of them that were physician administered. And one of the Australian doctors in a pre-conference workshop with Dr. Green basically challenged her, saying physician administered, because there were only 7 self-administered ones in Canada, I think, in 2022. So people much prefer to have the doctor do it for them. And I think he was arguing partly tongue-in-cheek, but he was basically saying, well, that's not really good patient-centered care, is it? You know, if they have to depend on the convenience of the doctor. And yeah, anyhow, Dr. Green, they had a good to and fro. And then he told a story about going to a friend's provision who just wanted him there, hearing about it at the last minute, and, you know, getting on his bike and rushing across town and having an accident, breaking his wrist, and still making it there. So I don't know, this whole thing about, you know, if you do it at the physician's convenience, it won't help the patient, was kind of overcome by his story.
Right.
I hope that answered it somewhat.
Yeah, I think that did answer the question. And it sounds like there were so many poignant learning opportunities at this conference, whether it was personal shared stories or those from our sort of sister organizations across the world. So I want to thank you for bringing that to us today. I'm sure I speak for everyone here saying I learned so very much. We still do have a couple minutes left. So if anybody has a burning question, and I know someone out there must, you know, we invite you to raise your hand, or even if it's just maybe a discussion or something that you have a takeaway from today, please feel welcome to bring that. I'm sure we'd love to hear it.
I'd like to hear Kelsey on what happened in Reykjavik in Iceland.
All right, Kelsey, do you want to give us a bit of some takeaways from what you learned in Iceland?
Oh, yeah, nice to see everybody. So this conference in Iceland back in October was because there has been some movement in that country, as Sherry spoke about earlier. So it was representatives from Canada, which was me, and the Netherlands and Switzerland. So a lot of the takeaways that we learned in Ireland were also shared at this conference from the Switzerland and Netherlands representatives. But what happened with the Iceland movement is there was a bill, and Sherry also alluded to this earlier, that sometimes these private members' bills just die on the table. And unfortunately, what happened shortly after we were all in Iceland was that this bill died because there was an election and everything changed. So as far as I know at this point, once government gets back together and things start moving, they're hopeful that there'll be more movement. But this election just happened a few weeks ago. So kind of starting again with a hopeful bill or movement on the assisted dying front. But the organization there is doing a lot of great work, and certainly hopeful that things can move forward there.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey, for sharing that. It's too bad to hear that happened, but hopefully with their fresh start, they make some progress. Okay, going into our last couple minutes, anybody with any final thoughts, questions, comments?
Sorry, did we get to that question about suffering in the Q&A? From Catherine?
From Catherine, I'm not seeing a question about suffering, but do you have that question available to read, Kelsey?
Maybe I can only see them. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
So Catherine asked, the term suffering has been used as a criteria. How is this term defined, and how are communities able to judge whether that is something that is experienced?
Yeah, like I don't know of it being defined. We have learned how to define our enduring and intolerable suffering from our own made legislation. And even though mental illness as the sole underlying medical condition is excluded from our legislation until 2027, it's still, you can be suffering. It can be, as long as you've met the grievous medical condition provisions, which have to do with the physical illness, your suffering can be psychiatric. And so I know that we have, over our 8 years, basically looked at enduring and intolerable suffering as being physical, as being mental, as being existential. Because I think that the greatest reason given for people seeking mate and our country is the lack of moments of joy and the kind of living that they used to be able to do. Now that's very existential. It isn't pain. I think pain is down the list a little bit, and not being able to, because our physicians are very good at managing pain for the most part, until people seem to be really at end of life. So that's the way we have done suffering. I'm just looking, the Australian one is can't be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable, which is the same. We also say that it has to be objective. You can't objectively determine whether or not I'm suffering. I can explain to you why I'm suffering, and that should be acceptable in most cases. I'm looking at the Netherlands law. They refer to the patient experiencing unbearable suffering with no prospect of improvement. So they all use slightly different wording, but I don't remember ever seeing any of them where it was actually defined.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Sherry. It seems like we have a question here from Francis. If you want to bring that to the floor, please feel welcome to unmute.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any discussion, or what sort of discussion went on there about the actual how advance requests could be brought about. I mean, because it's a very popular concept in Canada, as we know, but there's often a lot of resistance from physicians, and I think for quite understandable reasons. And I wondered whether that was discussed at all in any of the sessions there.
I really don't recollect any discussion of that, and I'm not surprised, because they are all at baby steps compared to us. They're trying to reassure their doctors that assisted dying is a good thing, where they help somebody self-administer, and their prognosis is that they're likely to die within 6 months. Yeah. And we are way, way beyond that. I mean, sure. Advanced requests, like, as you know, in terms of dementia or Alzheimer's, it forces us to an early death. But we always could have that under track 1 with the 10 minutes to midnight, et cetera. So the advanced request is like a really good insurance policy for us if we know we'll lose capacity, and we don't want to worry about when that's going to be. And Yeah. So yeah, no, I'm trying to think if Kelsey, if you remember anybody from who's more advanced, like the Netherlands or oh yeah, talking about advanced requests. I just I don't think it comes up. We're way ahead.
Yeah, I don't recall anything specifically at this conference. And I think for the countries that do have it, like the Netherlands and Belgium, for instance, I think that it's made in general is just treated very differently there than in other countries. It's something that so many family physicians just talk about. It's something that family doctors are involved in. So I feel like those discussions just kind of happen in a more natural way, the same way people talk about advanced care planning and healthcare decisions related to other things besides MAID. So I don't recall any specific mention of it at this conference, but certainly there's some countries that have been doing it for quite some time and seem to be handling it all well and keeping that patient-centered approach.
Yeah, that was something that I could mention about how slow this process is going to be in Ireland, even with the people at End of Life Ireland, as passionate as they are and as proactive as they are, is that they passed a law in Ireland in 2015. And that was just a capacity law, like basically to recognize advanced care directives. So that's how not to die. Like that, if I've lost capacity, my substitute decision maker can say, no, I don't want to feed. She doesn't want a feeding tube. She doesn't want this. She doesn't want that. And from 2015, it took until last year for that to be implemented. So, even getting the law in place is one thing, but then research was done with the Irish GPs about assisted dying. And the researcher, she said she got them during lockdown. So she got really long, rich interviews with everybody, which is pretty interesting. But she said that, there are those that are just simply opposed, those who are in full support. But the biggest group is Irish GPs who are not philosophically opposed, but have a lot of concerns. So we're just advanced requests is way down the road.
All right. Thank you for that, Sherry. And to bring a close to this and to bring it back home, both metaphorically and with our own legislation, somebody is wondering if we can just touch on where the current government is with our survey for advance requests here in Canada. They speak that November is over and we still have yet to hear anything. Do you want to take a moment to speak on that? And maybe if you need some support, Kelsey, as well.
Do you want me to go ahead, Sherry?
Yeah, you go. You know more than me. I know it's coming.
Yeah, so whoever asked that question, thank you for raising that. As we know, the government said that this consultation will be starting in November. November's done, as we all know. So we're still waiting to hear more. In the meantime, we're getting organized, getting prepared so that when we do have something and we do have action items for us to take at the staff level organizationally, for you to take as volunteers, for supporters on our list and on social media to take, we'll be as ready as we can for that. But we haven't heard anything more other than it's a pretty short timeline for this whole consultation, and we hope that we'll hear something soon so we actually have items we can work on and get as many people involved in that as we can.
Great. Thank you for answering that one, Kelsey. If nobody else has any questions, it looks like we're drawing to a close here. So I want to take the time to thank Sherry for bringing this to us. I so enjoyed this international context. It was so wonderful to learn about everything that you got to see in the conference. So thank you once again for joining us and for making this available to our volunteers. I'm sure it's greatly appreciated. And to our volunteers, thank you for all taking the time to join us. I hope that you learned something here today, or if not, at least you had a good time. And we look forward to seeing you all in the next webinar. Have a great night, everybody.